Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Pitzer, and I would like to welcome you to this discussion. For recording purposes, today is Thursday, April 10th, 2025. It is 2 p.m., and this is panel number 18167, titled, How Do We Fix Our Electoral System? Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. And while the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. One other thing I would like to mention before we start is that you will all get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we handle Q&A in these sessions. You will see producers on the edges of the room, and we are using a note card system. Anytime in the session, you may simply raise your hand and request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers and write your question down. We do ask that you please write legibly. If you are a student, please note on your card that you are so. When you finish writing your question, please raise your hand and the producer will gather the card and bring it to me. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each of our panelists. And for more information, you can read their full bios on the CWA website. Please join me in welcoming today's panel. First, we have Ellen Weintraub. Ellen is a former commissioner. She spent over 20 years with the U.S. Federal Election Commission. Next to her, we have Devin Gray, who is the president of End Poverty in California. And then we have Professor Paul DeDuke, who is associate teaching professor here at CU Boulder and the faculty director for the Engineering Leadership Program. And then we will be joined shortly by Representative Matt Soper. He has been called into a vote, but will be joining us shortly. He is the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee here in Colorado. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So Winston Churchill once famously said that democracy is the worst form of government, aside from all the others. And I think nothing reminds us of that more than every 4 years when we turn to the Electoral College. More than 6 in 10 Americans would prefer a dissolution of the Electoral College. This is based on a recent survey that the Pew Research Center did in the fall of 2024. So with that, setting it up, I'm going to ask a few framing questions, but really just have an open discussion with the expertise that we have here on the table. So starting with you, Ellen, given your experience as a former commissioner at the US FEC, can you explain a little for our audience the historical reasons for the establishment of the Electoral College and whether those reasons still hold true today?
I was not expecting that question. I'm not here as a historian. I'm a money and politics person, so I came prepared to talk about money and politics.
We'll get there, don't worry.
All righty. Well, as I said, I'm not a historian, so I think that my understanding is that originally the framers, the founders, didn't really trust the voters. They didn't trust the people to be able to make these decisions on their own, and they wanted to provide a little bit of distance between the people and the leaders that they were electing, and they envisioned the Electoral College as this group of wise leaders who would actually be exercising some judgment about who they were going to be picking, and wouldn't just be transmitting the choices of the voters. And I think that we have learned a lot in the last over 200 years. We're getting close to 250, and we have more faith in ourselves, and I think that is a good thing. And I would join with the 60 some odd % of people who would be happy to abolish the Electoral College at this point.
Thank you. Devin, oh yes, go ahead, Paul,
Can I respond
please.
to that?
Yes, absolutely.
I think that the Electoral College, well, first of all, I want to ask, like, do 6 in 10 Americans fully understand the Electoral College? I think it's actually a very hard thing to understand. I don't fully understand it, but what I do understand, at least, starting with its inception, it was a solution to a very hard problem, which is how do you get people from a heterogeneous nation with disparate local interests to agree on the selection of the executive? That's a hard thing to do, and the founders were very worried about the tyranny of the majority, majoritarian usurpation. And so they contrived this system, the Electoral College system, to respond to that problem. It's not been a great system, but it does have some upsides. And I think if we want to talk about abolishing the Electoral College, we should try to do so like thinking about it charitably, trying to understand its upside. And I'll just mention one upside. Yesterday, I was moderating a panel, and I was receiving questions, and I was very surprised by how many questions came in assuming that there had been voter suppression in the recent election, and even more than that, that there was like a conspiracy afoot to suppress voters. And one guy even got up, maybe he's even here, got up and said that Kamala Harris won the election. And it was sort of shocking to me in a way, because it just showed that this kind of thinking has a home on both the left and the right. This kind of thinking, really tends to undermine the perceived legitimacy of this process. So it's a problem. I'm sure Ellen will talk about it. But one of the good things about the Electoral College system is that it helps to contain precisely this kind of problem, because it means that elections are decentralized and up to the states. And so you can have a kind of malignancy, a political malignancy, and it's contained. And that's not nothing. And if you go to a national election and there's suspicion of voter fraud, it will be much harder to contain. So that's just one upside. I think there are others. If we want to talk about abandoning the Electoral College, I think there needs to be a serious, rigorous, balanced discussion.
Thank you. Devin, we can't talk, and we can't have this discussion about the Electoral College without talking about gerrymandering, voter suppression, campaign finance reform, all of those things. As president of End Poverty in California, how do you see the Electoral College impacting poverty and social justice issues?
Well, I think the Electoral College conversation fits into a broader set of questions around the extent to which democracy is indeed representative, right? the Electoral College conversation is the same conversation as gerrymandering. It's the same as the question around Senate apportionment. It's the same question of whether we extend voting rights to people who are in the District of Columbia for congressional representation, or to Puerto Rico or other overseas territories with any election, really, right? Like it's an overall question of, are we accurately reflecting popular will in the outcomes of our elections? I'll take one. That's good. One applause is good. No. As it pertains to policy outcomes, though, I mean, elections are the path towards policy change, right? And maybe it didn't happen in this past presidential election, one where people in poverty shifted towards the right, which is a cause for a great amount of reflection among policy advocates, of course. And there was congruence between the popular vote result and the Electoral College result. But it would be impossible to ignore that when there is a discordance between the popular vote outcomes and the Electoral College outcomes, there are questions of democratic legitimacy, right? Like, I don't think that it is inaccurate to say that it's damaging to trust in democratic institutions if there is a sentiment that popular will is not reflected, because maybe it's been filtered through an archaic system that, again, doesn't reflect popular will. So I think it's bad when people question the results of elections. I think it's just as bad, if not worse, if you allow for widespread distrust in electoral results based off of a system that doesn't reflect like the core democratic, like lowercase democratic values.
Thank you. Representative Soper, thank you for joining us. As a native Coloradan, you have seen the political climate in Colorado move from red to purple to blue. How do you see the Electoral College impacting state level politics and access to federal level?
That's a great question. Hopefully my mic is on here. As probably most people are aware, we adopted the National Popular Vote Compact here in Colorado. It hasn't come into force because we haven't seen a number of states that would be able to effectuate the electing of the president adopt the National Popular Vote Compact. But that's a good example of where states, including Colorado, have taken a position to interact with how the Electoral College plays out. As far as like shifting dynamics within Colorado, I mean, I was first elected in 2018. That was the last year that the Republicans held the state Senate. And so many people have said, was that a shift in political demographics in Colorado? You know, are we a different state than maybe we were 10 or 20 years ago? I mean, you could say yes. I would actually argue there's some shifting of the ideology, and that the electorate as a whole perhaps has not changed as much as people may think, but that definitely the parties have repositioned, and we're in a time of certainly refocusing on what those ideologies are. I mean, if I were to have told you that as Republicans we would be supporting tariffs even 18 months ago, many people would have probably been shocked to hear that that's now a policy position of the Republican Party. Likewise, to have the Democrat Party be more for free trade. We probably wouldn't have heard that conversation 18 months ago either. And you know, that's just the topic of the day, but there's probably at least a dozen of those issues that I could point out that really shows where the two sides are actually seeing where we stand, and it's at the state level. And I can tell you what happens at the state level also filters up to the national level, and vice versa.
Thank you. Since we're talking about state, I want to go to, we were talking a bit about it before we came in the room, gerrymandering. It has had large-scale implications for at least over the last decade on many congressional races and really the division of power. Ellen, would you mind addressing, you've seen firsthand, I'm sure at the FEC, the impacts of this and the many changes that it's causing and has caused?
Well, I've seen it more just as a close observer of what's going on in Congress. And there are a number of states where if you look at how many people voted for Democrats and how many voted for Republicans, you get a roughly 50-50 split. They're purple states. And yet, because of gerrymandering, one side has a supermajority in the state legislature and potentially in the congressional delegation as well. And I think this is bad for governance because, well, for one thing, it undermines representative government because the government is not actually representative of the voters, even if there are, people move the lines around so that it is roughly an equal number of people in each district. But the people who turn out in primaries, and the big choice happens in the primaries rather than the general. The people who turn out in primaries tend to be people on the extremes of the party because, I wish everybody voted in primaries, but they don't. And then what you get because of gerrymandering is once whoever gets nominated in the primary, even if a lot of people in the state say, well, it wouldn't have been my first choice, that's the person for their party, so that's who they vote for. And then you end up with people in Congress, and I'm sure this also happens at the state legislative level, who can't really talk to each other because they are so far apart. So you have problems of governance because people are too polarized and too far apart to make any reasonable deals together, and you have a problem of representation because despite the fact that there are a lot of folks who will turn out and vote for one party or the other, their voices aren't really reflected because of the way the lines are drawn. And of course, this goes back to the beginnings of the Republic. Eldridge Gerry is the guy they named gerrymandering after, and he was one of the original representatives from New England, but it wasn't so scientific back then. Now we can do it with computers, and it is just an incredibly powerful device. So we know how to fix that problem. We can go to independent redistricting commissions, and the states that have done that have fairer elections, I think, and more representative elections. And I like to talk about what happened in Michigan, where a young woman named Katie Fahey, who had never done any political organizing before, posted on her Facebook page that, how frustrated she was about gerrymandering and was there anybody else who agreed with her. And it turned out there were tons of people who responded to her on Facebook, and she organized a movement. They got a petition on a ballot initiative on the state ballot, and they changed the way the districts were allocated in Michigan, and it changed laws in Michigan as a result. So this is a problem that can be solved, and we know how to solve it.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who comes from a state that has transitioned to an independent redistricting commission, I think it has yielded really good results. It's also led to, I would say, many more competitive House seats, which I think, given the ways that the political winds blow, allows for, I think, more accurate representation of the political will in a given year. Like we have almost 40 House districts in California. It's a massive state, but every year we see some flip, right? And in a state that is just as politically polarized one way or the other, but they're drawn by partisan lines, you just never see shifts in representation based off of the political mood, which I think, again, is pretty anti-democratic. I would say, though, that in many ways, we don't always frame it this way, but the state lines themselves are a gerrymander in some ways, right? Like we have a Senate that rewards arbitrary lines for states versus population. My home state has 39 million people. We get 2 senators. Wyoming has under 1 million people. They get 2 senators. Obviously, there are historical reasons for why Senate apportionment was made in the compromise that it was. There are reasons for that. But obviously, I think we can all recognize that states are far less like individually distinct polities today than they were at the time of the founding, right? Like we do say the United States is, not the United States are. Like we are a single political entity at this point. And the differences in sort of state identity, I think, are significantly less pronounced today than they were back in the 1700s. But what it leads to, of course, is an underrepresentation of people who happen to live in crowded states. And what are the outcomes for that yield political outcomes in one chamber of the legislature that, again, is required for passing any sort of legislation. It allows for a tremendous overrepresentation of underpopulated states relative to states like California or even Texas, right? It's not necessarily a partisan issue either.
But like what you're talking about is one of the original features of the Electoral College, that it was designed to ensure that candidates spread their attention across the whole nation. So, if you took seats away from, less important so-called flyover states, would national candidates pay any attention to them? I mean,
I don't see national candidates going to Wyoming, though, right? Because it seems like the political attention flows to competitiveness, not size, right? Like people go to Florida, or they used to, right, when it was competitive, not because it's big or small, but because it's close politically. People don't go to Alaska, they don't go to Wyoming.
but if you took that check away, wouldn't candidates just go to the most populous states, and wouldn't it, really diminish the extent to which the interior of America would have a political say?
And if we could hear Representative Soper, if you'd like to chime in here.
Sure,
I
sure.
know you want to make a comment.
Yeah, I was going to quickly jump in and say that, as states being laboratories of democracy, I mean, Colorado is a great example of where we were a unique state in how we passed a redistricting commission for both state and congressional reapportionment. So much so that even when the U.S. Supreme Court was citing states as an example, we were the state that was listed in the footnote. And I will say that I do like the laboratories of democracy, and I like the fact that Colorado can choose a system that may not be exactly like a Wyoming or a New Hampshire or a California, but also there has to be some recognition for the fact that states still are a sovereign entity within themselves. And I say that because I could work really hard to pass a law, and almost overnight it could impact every single person in this room. And I don't know when it was the last time that Congress ever passed a law that impacted every single one of us in this room, but we still need to have that respect for the state legislature and the states as a legal and political entity, and that's where the U.S. Senators recognize that. It's that 2 seats that recognize the states as being their own legal and political entity that actually make up the United States. So we're still a dual federalist system, the way I see it.
Thank you. Before we turn to some of the questions, I just want to visit another issue that I think that it's important that we talk about with the Electoral College, and that is campaign finance. As everyone knows, the most recent presidential election was the most expensive ever held. And the numbers for congressional seats continue to rise. You're going to be sorry you sat by me because I call on you first every time.
No, this is my sweet spot.
You're
I'm ready
right.
for
I know.
this.
I can see you smiling. You're ready. So, upsides, downsides, public finance. What do we do?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about money. The FEC, if you didn't already know this, regulates money in politics. That is the only thing that the Federal Election Commission does. So this is my jam, as they say. This last election, we had about $16 billion that was raised and spent in this election. Not actually the most expensive election in history. In fact, if you adjust for inflation, 2020 was actually more expensive. But it was close. It was close. But what we have seen is a continued and increasing influence of very, very wealthy donors. So it used to be unheard of for an individual to spend $100 million to try and get their favorite candidates elected. But in the last election, we had 6 individuals or couples who donated more than $100 million, and one, who you can guess who donated $291 million to various political committees. And that is a direct result of decisions by the Supreme Court. Everybody knows about Citizens United. It actually is a much deeper problem than that. It goes back to the Buckley v. Vallejo decision in 1975 at the very beginning of the Federal Election Commission and the Federal General Election Campaign Act. Our Supreme Court decided that money is basically like speech, and that if you limit money, that you are limiting speech, and therefore you cannot limit how much is spent. And that is not the only way that one could devise a campaign finance system, by the way. If you want to look north a little bit to Canada, when faced with the exact same question, they said, gee, if you let everybody spend as much as they want, then the rich people are going to drown out the voices of the less rich people. And that is, and both countries are designed to try and promote, this is their goal, to promote the most robust debate about the issues, and to get all the issues out there to have the best informed electorate on all the issues. And these two countries have come to the exact opposite conclusions of how you do that, where our Supreme Court says the best way to inform the public is to have no limits on on the amount of money that gets spent, although there are limits on contributions to individual candidates and party committees. And the Canadian Supreme Court came to the opposite conclusion, said the only way to have a well-informed and balanced debate about all these issues is to have some limits on spending. So I think it's important to know that the way we do things is not the only way that it could be done. Having said that, that is the way our Supreme Court has decided it, and they are pretty entrenched on this. So how do we respond to that? Well, I think public funding actually is a very good idea. It's being done at some state and local levels, mostly at the local levels. New York City has a robust public funding system. And a lot of people don't like that because they say it's welfare for politicians and we don't want to pay our tax dollars for campaigns because we hate all those campaign ads anyway. But if you have the public funding the campaigns, then the candidates are less indebted to the individual donors, and you don't get the kind of system that we have now, where the voices of those donors are so important. And now we are in this really unprecedented situation where the richest man in the world, who was the biggest donor in the last election, literally moved into the White House to start, pulling out his chainsaw and affecting government policy and the services that we all are going to get from government. So I don't feel real great about that result in this system, although the good news is that money isn't everything. And we saw that in Wisconsin, where in a race for, so you know this story, in a race for a state judicial seat, which used to be these really, backwater elections that nobody paid any attention to. There was $100 million spent on this election, and the voters turned out in force to say, hell no, we don't want people buying a judicial seat. We are going to vote against the big money candidate. So I think that was actually kind of inspiring.
Thank you. Turning to some of our questions, we have a lot around ranked choice voting, asking if that is the solution to the Electoral College. Devin, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, it's actually something we've talked about in one of the office hours. I think in terms of, at a theoretical level, the idea that you're able to not just have one choice and sort of that be the binary, I'm voting for this person and therefore I'm voting against everyone else, sort of makes sense at a philosophical level, right? It enables for third-party candidates to be, you can vote for them without having to risk the spoiler effect. There's like intellectual reasons why I think it's a really interesting idea. In California, at the local level, we've implemented ranked choice voting in places like San Francisco and Oakland. And I think there have been some unintended consequences around it, mainly around just like it's a confusing ballot. Like you have to rank multiple votes. People don't quite understand the system. There's different ways to administer ranked choice voting as well. And it's not always led to a tremendous amount of voter satisfaction in a way that you might think intellectually it would. It's not necessarily led to minor party candidates getting more traction. In Oakland, the mayor who was elected via ranked choice voting was recalled. Again, small sample size, and maybe there's a need for greater experimentation with it. There's also, and I think something we've talked about is, in the typical ranked choice voting system, the folks who don't make it past a certain threshold, their votes for the second choice votes for the folks who voted for the bottom candidates get redistributed. But then a lot of times those voters sort of have more fringe beliefs, so you're not always necessarily capturing like the majoritarian public sentiment. So there's flaws with it, but I think the impulse to think about ways in which we can find electoral systems that better reflect public will is a good impulse, even if we're not quite finished with the experimentation, haven't maybe nailed the correct way to administer a type of ranked choice vote.
Thank you.
Ellen, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Oh, that's great. Great. Another question that we have, are there electoral systems in the world where popular voting systems can be studied, can be trusted? Are there any examples out there around the world where the popular voting system in democracy is worthy?
I believe, in Australia and New Zealand, they have a really interesting mix of you vote for your particular, it's a parliamentary system, right? You vote for your particular member of parliament, but you also vote for towards like a proportional representation as well. So it's a mixed system. It's a little bit confusing, and I don't know it perfectly well. But what they're trying to do essentially is preserve a sense of local representation while also trying to make sure that the national government is represented, or better representative of the popular will. So you almost cast two ballots at once, I think, is the way that it works. So that's interesting. But even in parliamentary systems like in Canada or the UK, you run the risk in many cases of still having a minoritarian government where, because each individual seat is first past the post, you can think of many examples where a party can win national power and a supermajority of seats while only winning 40-something% of the total vote, and that's not perfect either, right? I still think it's better than like having certain people's votes count for more than others, but again, it's not a perfect reflection of popular will. So, I think the folks in the Southern Hemisphere might have a couple of interesting ideas.
Yeah. Great. Paul?
I just want to say one point on that, and that is that, to the best of my knowledge, there is no other country in the world that has an electoral college system. And even when U.S. people go around the world to developing democracies to try and advise them on how to put their government together, we never recommend an electoral college system.
Yeah, no one's chosen to imitate it. It's very true. They imitate many other dimensions of American constitutionalism, but not this instrument, yeah.
So Paul, when we started, you talked a little bit about just the distrust that people have in the voting system. And it seems like the ideological divide between Democrats and Republicans gets further and further apart. Would dissolving the Electoral College and replacing it with something else bring that divide closer together, or we run the risk of alienating the two sides even more? Interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I can sympathize with the view that might want to take that seriously as a solution or some sort of corrective. But after encountering those views that I mentioned earlier yesterday, and then thinking about it a little bit since then, it seems to me that, again, I would emphasize the upsides of the Electoral College system and decentralized federalism. I think there's a lot of ways in which this system that America currently has acts as a prophylactic against the spread of things that could, in a rapid way, be very undermining if you nationalized or centralized the electoral system. If you went to a national popular vote and there was suspicion of widespread fraud, it could be very, very hard and expensive to contain. So, plus I think too, it just dismantling the system would be very, let's say, psychologically and politically expensive to do. It would take, I mean, there have been moments in our history where America's been close, but probably you would need more consensus than currently exists, or that seems to be on the near-term horizon.
I want to say a few words about voter fraud. There is no evidence that there is any kind of widespread voter fraud in this country. Thank you. I'm glad you all recognize that, because it is this, and it is a very damaging conspiracy theory that is out there. We have, and right this week, there are consequences in Congress on this theory. This notion that there are all these people voting illegally. First of all, it doesn't really make sense, because if you think about it, an individual who votes, who is not entitled to vote, changes one vote. Probably not going to change the outcome of the election. And they are putting themselves at risk of criminal penalties if they are if they're not allowed to vote because they're not a citizen of this country. They're risking deportation. The risks are extremely high for the individual who would do this. And while I can't say it has never happened, there have been incidents of voter fraud, and we have caught them. But it is not widespread at all. It is infinitesimal compared to the number of people who vote in every election. But because this myth has been spread, and some people are doing it quite intentionally, they are spreading this myth that there are all these illegal voters out there. There are legislative consequences. Then they say, well, I have to respond, the folks in Congress say, I have to respond to all the people out there who are my constituents who are concerned about this voter fraud. Whether it exists or not, people are concerned about it, so we have to respond to it. So just in the last 24 hours, a bill passed in the House called the SAVE Act, which would require people to establish that they are U.S. citizens in order to vote. And we know from studies that have been done by the Brennan Center, for example, that half of the population doesn't have a passport, okay? And it's expensive and it's cumbersome to get a passport, so there's a socioeconomic skew to the people who have passports versus the ones who don't. And there are millions of women who have changed their names when they got married. I didn't, and I'm proud that I didn't, because, you know, this is yet another reason why it's a good thing to have kept my name. But if you show up with your birth certificate as proof that you're a U.S. citizen, but you changed your name when you got married, it's not going to match the name on the birth certificate. So now you've got to have two pieces of paper. You need your birth certificate and you need your marriage certificate. And you have to show up in person in order to demonstrate all this. So you lose online registration, and you lose a lot of ways that people are registered to vote today. And a lot of people, millions of people, would be disenfranchised if this bill passes into law. It has passed the House. It is now at the Senate. I'm giving you all an assignment. Every single one of you should contact your senator, both of your senators, reach out to all your friends and have them contact their senators, because the Senate is the only thing that stands between us and the adoption of this bill, which is prompted by the Speaker of the House saying, well, we don't have any real proof that people are voting illegally, that undocumented persons are voting illegally, but we know intuitively that it must be happening. Well, I'm a lawyer and I want to see some hard evidence, and there isn't any. So contact your senators. One of the advantages of my having been fired from my government position is I can now say this, which I couldn't have done as a government employee. Contact your senators and tell them to vote against the SAVE Act.
So this ties in nicely. We have a student question, and I want to start at the end of the table and would just really appreciate everyone's thoughts on this, because everyone in here is a voter, right? That's our right. And the student asks, what would you say to young people who are dissuaded from voting in national elections because, whether rightly or wrongly, they believe their vote doesn't matter because of the Electoral College? How do we address this issue and encourage better youth voter turnout?
Yeah, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, I just stepped off to vote on the state budget, speaking of voting. I would tell that student, if you've ever been in an election in which you had an exact tie, when I ran for student office at Colorado Mesa University, I had an exact tie. And that tells you the power of one vote. Either one vote more or one vote less, and the election could have gone another way. This past election in the House of Representatives, in the primary, we had one of our members who won by 3 votes. 3 votes. And then in the general, we had another member who won her seat by 3 votes as well. That really shows how it's really almost a flip of a coin, like who turns out, because they can make a real difference as far as predicting the outcome. And the thing of it is, that's at a legislative level or a student level, but that also makes a difference as far as who your members of Congress are, eventually impacting how the state goes for voting for president. Now, it's been a while since we've had an election that close, but you think about the 2000 election. I mean, incredibly close. And so to say that your vote doesn't count, it absolutely does. I'll just say one last thing on this point. My district is a very red district, but it's also a district where people turn out. About 85% of those who can vote turn out to vote. If you look at Denver, they're as blue as my district is red, but yet only 20% of those who can vote do vote. And that's a real shame, because it shows that some people believe that their vote just doesn't matter. So they basically are delegating their power to the few that do turn out to vote. So if you want to change an outcome, go vote, go knock on doors, make a difference.
Yeah, I would say the student should not think of the significance of voting so much in strict quantitative terms, but just as part of your general responsibility, your civic responsibility. You know, the founding generation worried about the health of the American regime. You know, they sort of calibrated it to the levels of education and civic spiritedness of the electorate. And voting is part of how that's demonstrated. And I would just say, look, it's just part of taking your politics seriously, and getting out to vote, not being apathetic is important.
Yeah, I think fully agree with that. I think, you know, yes, there's the civic duty piece. There's the fact that down ballot races are extraordinarily meaningful, obviously, and you know, but I want to address even just like the presidential election consequences of that, because it's a little bit more opaque. I think it is difficult to make like the quantitative argument if you're in a state that's not a purple state about how your vote counts towards the presidential election. I think it does matter. I think the total vote tally, the popular vote outcomes for a president does matter. I think it affects the mood of the electorate after an election. I think it dictates the perceived political capital that an administration has going into office. I think it's no coincidence that we've seen two different phenomena post-Trump's victory this time compared to 2016, where one, he's claiming an enormous mandate because he won the popular vote despite the fact that he didn't win a majority, and is still among, in terms of popular vote contest, among the closest in American history, still claiming a mandate with some kernel of credibility because of winning the popular vote. And you're seeing, I at least perceive this as a Democrat, a much more muted opposition compared to 2016, again, because of the sort of attitudinal deflation that comes from losing the popular vote. So I think it matters, even if not for the actual the electoral outcome itself. I think when we're shaping the sort of takeaways of what the electorate actually wants, it really matters that people's views are captured in the popular vote, even if, again, it doesn't affect the way that a state votes one way or the other.
I agree with all of that, and I just want to emphasize the importance of educating oneself about state and local issues. Every member of the House of Representatives is on the ballot every 2 years, and control of the Senate every cycle also. A third of the Senate is up. But there's also governors, state legislatures, and I think we can see from the evidence of our panel how wonderful it is to have thoughtful, smart people in the state legislature, right? We want that. And we get that when we have an informed electorate and they choose wisely.
So this is another student question, and I think the entire country is struggling to try to answer this, but what can be done to protect nonpartisan organizations from partisan and presidential influence? And there may not be an answer for this. We're kind of building the ship on the water right now, as they say. So,
do we have a sense of what kind of nonpartisan organization we're talking about here?
well, the one reference is the FEC, independent redistricting organizations, things of those nature.
Oh, okay. I thought we were talking about private,
No.
you know, like the League of Women Voters. I know we have somebody here from the League of Women Voters, which is another problem. I think we all need to be very vigilant and very concerned right now. as many of you know, I mean, talking about, if you want to talk specifically about the FEC, it's supposed to be a bipartisan body, 6 commissioners, no more than 3 from any one political party, there's a way of replacing commissioners. It's by nominating a new commissioner. That didn't happen this time. I was just flat out fired. And that's, I think, not a good thing for the country, but there are still 4 commissioners, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the commission. I think the greater concern is with an administration that seems to want to dictate to all of the independent agencies what their policies should be. And there's an intimidation factor of, I think that my firing was not just about me. It was about intimidating other people and scaring them into thinking that they shouldn't put their head up and they shouldn't take controversial positions. We have the specter in the last 24 hours of another executive order talking about identifying specific individuals from the last administration. People, ironically, that this president actually appointed originally, who then quite honestly stood up and said the election was fair and there wasn't any voter fraud, and now they're the subject of punitive action from the White House. And I think some of those issues are going to be resolved by the courts. I've seen some promising decisions already, but I do think that this is an issue that people need to be very aware of and need to be focused on and bringing to the attention of their legislators at the state and at the federal level, because it is very concerning.
Any other comment? Please.
Yeah, I would just add a quick comment that I don't necessarily know that I have a good answer, but I do have an explanation. It reminds me of a book by Richard Neustadt, The Power of the Modern Presidency. And Neustadt was first looking at the FDR administration and testing the power of the presidency there, and you were either regime builders or regime maintainers was how his theory went on. And I see right now the current administration really testing the outer limits of presidential power, and this will go down as a point in history, I mean, regardless of where you are in politics, but feeling what can an executive do and what can't an executive do, and then will Congress take back some of the power they've delegated. And I think we are in a giant experiment, as it were.
Great. So we have a lot of questions around Citizens United. Yes. Just taking from them, wouldn't ending Citizens United make the playing field more even for the candidates, is one perspective that's been asked. And just around it opening and making more fair elections. What is the feasibility of Citizens United ending?
Well, it's interesting that the question was framed in terms of leveling the playing field, because that exact phrase has come up in several Supreme Court opinions. And the Supreme Court says this is a bad thing. We don't want to level the playing field. And it's the only competition that we have. Think about a sports competition. Think about any other kind of competition that we have where the ultimate arbiters, the Supreme Court, has decided, no, we don't want to have a level playing field. And their argument is, to me, it's somewhat incoherent, I have to say. They say, well, some people are good looking and some people have other talents, they're celebrities, and some people just raise a lot of money. So we all have our own skill sets, and then people can compete based on how they do, which of their talents comes to the fore. I am offended by a system that gives more power to people who have more money, because we're all equal citizens and we should all have an equal voice. But the reality is, this court ain't going there. We are not gonna, as I said, Citizens United was only one in a long series of opinions that this court has issued, and there's been turnover in the membership of the court. They weren't issuing good opinions on campaign finance 50 years ago, and it's only gotten worse since then. And that's why I think there are states and localities that have been experimenting with things like public funding that can still get past the constitutional barricades. There are also some bills in Congress, the Disclose Act, the Honest Ads Act, that would help to address some of the problems in the system, at least make sure that we understand where the money's coming from. I think the FEC, frankly, could do a better job of policing that. It has not really covered itself in glory when it comes to making sure that we don't have dark money in our system. Say what you want about Elon Musk. At least he's out front about it. We know who he is and we know how much money he's spending. There are other billionaires out there who are funneling their money through nonprofit organizations in ways that are designed to hide who they are. And frankly, none of us pays that much attention to this. If you looked at the list of the top 100 donors, go to opensecrets.org, they've got a great database there. If you looked at the list of the top 100 donors, I guarantee you wouldn't recognize most of the names on that list. Nobody knows who these guys are, and yet they are incredibly influential. So part of this is can be addressed, I think, by our all, taking our citizenship responsibilities a little bit more seriously and trying to inform ourselves on who these folks are. But part of the responsibility lies with the FEC, and part of the responsibility lies with the Supreme Court. But there are some laws that could be passed and would survive constitutional scrutiny, I believe.
Anyone? We have a couple other questions related to the size of the House of Representatives.
Oh, great.
As a balance to the Electoral College. The size and number of membership has been maintained for decades. Is that a possible solution to people's concerns about the Electoral College increasing representation and the number of seats in Congress?
I'll jump in and take a stab at that. Yes, I would like to see the U.S. House of Representatives increase their population for several reasons. One, thank you. One would be you don't want your representative to have to represent so many people that the communities of interest are so diverse and so great that it puts an incredible burden on the representative to try to effectively represent such diverse groups of people. I mean, now that we're approaching districts that are just under 1 million people in size, I mean, that's huge across the nation. And you get out, of course, to districts out west. I mean, they're huge geographically. In California, you may have some cities where they're only a few blocks big, but that is still very difficult for representation. So if you were only representing even 200,000 or 250,000, that's far different than at 1 million for the quality of representation. The other thing that I would also tack on to that is I would have members of Congress have to sit as a body, much more like state legislatures do as well. Right now, if you've ever watched Congress, they waltz in, they may interact when they're voting, which they'll keep the voting machine open for 15 or 20 minutes, but then they all go back to their offices, they may see each other on the committee, but it's all organized ahead of time, and so you don't really have this thoughtful approach that you do at the state legislative level. And if you talk to any member of Congress who went from the state legislature to Congress, that will be their number one complaint, is that they never see their colleagues. And so if you want to break down the barrier and you want members to break bread with each other and be a little bit more bipartisan and at least try to come to a compromise, you've actually got to know the person on the other side of the aisle, and it means spending time together with that person.
When I was in Washington, D.C., I worked at length with Tom Daschle, and he once said the two worst things to happen to Congress were the 24-hour news cycle and cheap airfare.
That's true.
And
That's true.
he used to be able to fly home about once a month, and then accessible airfare, he was able to fly home every week. And going to your point, they come into session on Tuesday, they leave on Thursday, and they spend their weekends in their district, and they really lost that connection with their colleagues across the aisle.
Yeah, that's a real problem.
I'll be brief because I think folks have thoughts on this too. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think genuinely we should triple the size of the House. I really believe that for a number of reasons. I don't think that it necessarily solves the Electoral College problem. Maybe the math, like marginally, but doesn't get to the core of it. But I think it addresses two other things that really matter, which Matt talked about. One is proximity to democracy, I think, matters. I think proximity to representation matters. to feel that you will have agency over political outcomes that affect you. I think when there is a bigger, when you have a larger population that is part of your given district, there's a distance that comes with that. We certainly see that in California, where we have a bicameral legislature, 80 members of our lower chamber, 40 members of our upper chamber, but in a state of 40 million people, that means that every state senator represents 1 million people. And to my second point and related, what are the campaign finance consequences of that? Where if you're an upstart candidate who wants to represent your hometown in the state legislature, you have to raise millions and millions of dollars to be able to compete for even a state assembly seat, which represents, again, almost 500,000 people. So what are the barriers to entry there? It becomes incredibly difficult to unseat incumbents. It becomes incredibly difficult for grassroots candidates to find any sort of traction. And so it exacerbates, again, the campaign finance regime that we currently have, which rewards folks who are able to fundraise from large dollar donors. So there's a real democratic proximity issue that I think we have to deal with here. And I think that we would have a lot greater trust in government if people felt that there was a more increased closeness between themselves, their neighbors, and the representation in whether it be a state capital or in DC. Thank you.
So this question, this is a question for each panelist. What do you think the chances are that there will be a midterm election in 2026? I got 2 or 3 of these, so.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an easy answer from my perspective. I mean, I see the election for sure happening in 2026. I don't really have a doubt in my mind. I mean, if history proves me wrong, of course, we'll judge that as it comes.
Yeah, I feel similarly.
Yeah.
There better be, right? No, but I think to some points that have been made earlier, one of the benefits of having a decentralized electoral system, there is a bulwark against that fear, I think. Now, look, there might be other shenanigans that take place. You can have an election be held and you can still have someone putting their finger on the scale. That's what I'm worried about. But whether or not, on November 5th, whatever the date is in 2026, people will be casting votes.
Yeah, I mean, it's always worth remembering that the rationale for having a decentralized federated system is presuming that shenanigans will always be in the background. I mean, the decentralization is set up as a corrective, right? That the system is meant to work even if humans are not angels, which, they're not.
Yeah.
So,
Especially when power's involved.
Yeah, that's
No,
correct.
totally agree that there will be an election.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all, and just want to allow you an opportunity to just share some final thoughts. And I want to thank you for all your great discussion, the positivity, and it's great to be able to sit down with a bipartisan group of people and have a really fair and wonderful conversation. So thank you, and I'd love to hear from you at the end.
I think I've already made a lot of the points that I want to make. I do think I was not fixated on the Electoral College in particular. I think there are a lot of issues that we can talk about, and there are some that are harder to resolve than others. I think that there are good proposals, as I said, in Congress, the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, that would make voting more accessible, which I think would be a good thing. I want everyone to participate. In Australia, they are mandated to vote. It is an actual law, and most people do. The penalty isn't that high, but most people view it as their civic responsibility, and they turn out and vote. So it would be nice if we could sort of inculcate that same sense of, everybody has this as their responsibility to be informed and to vote. I know that things can be depressing. I know I am frequently depressed these days, but I don't think that tuning out is the answer. I think that what this means is that we need to tune in better. We need to be more astute, perhaps, about what sources of information we're using when we're educating ourselves, and certainly more astute about what information we're sharing, to hit on some topics that came up in other panels. I think we could have better transparency at the federal level and probably at the state level as well. And I just want to repeat my imploring all of you to contact your senators and tell them to vote against the SAVE Act.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be super brief. I really think that the future of our democratic institutions relies on the public's trust, right? And I think to the extent that the systems through which we decide how representation is apportioned, the rules of the game that we allow for in the actual conducting of elections, and the proximity that people feel towards their democratic representation are all things that contribute to either trust or mistrust in the broader democratic system. I think it really matters for a whole host of reasons, but I think to the extent that we can allow our institutions and our democratic practices to be nimble and to be able to better chase public trust, because I think it's a real currency in this moment, I think we'll be stronger as a country for it. So thanks, y'all.
I know it's easy to fixate on what's going on in Washington. The media encourages it, but there are real reasons to be concerned and to pay your attention in that direction. But I always say this to my students, that really you should focus on your local politics. Like, that's really where politics impacts you most. It's not as glamorous, it's not as exciting, but I think just as a function of civic responsibility, it's really good to stay informed about what's going on locally, because a lot of decisions that matter for you, like, immediately happen in local politics. So.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Being a state legislator, I will say that I'll give you just 4 quick bullet points since I had to step out and encapsulate that. But a focus on state legislative politics, I think, should be more emphasized as we look to our democratic Republican systems, because your legislature is as important as Congress, and we tend to forget that. So I would probably equalize pay of a legislator across America to that a member of Congress makes, to try to elevate the same level of respect. By the same token, I would also look to, we talked about Citizens United, and if I could live in a perfect world, certainly as a candidate who's run multiple elections, to not have money go through independent expenditure committees or 527s, but to go through the candidate committee. I will never say bad things against my opponent directly, but a 527 absolutely will, and they will defame, they will do some of the worst things that you've seen or read, but certainly if a candidate had to compete head-to-head and fully disclose who all your donors were. I mean, that's what you don't see from independent expenditure committees. And then while I'm giving you my laundry list, the last 2 items, I do believe that we aren't set in stone how we elect our candidates, and that we have a caucus and assembly system here in Colorado and in many other states, but that doesn't mean that has to be our only system. And I think that it's healthy for every generation to talk about what is the best way to elect our candidates. In this last election, I supported ranked choice voting. I believe that there's lots of advantages to a ranked choice voting system. I won't get into those details here since it's sort of in my conclusion remarks. But the last thing that I would say is it's also fair to relook at term limits as well. In the Colorado legislature, no, thank you. The average tenure of a House member is 3 years. The average tenure of a state senator is 4 years. It means all of the institutional knowledge has shifted to the lobby or the bureaucracy, and that's not fair. That's not a representative democracy. When someone shows up, they are only going to be there for a few years, and they're relying on the institutional knowledge of someone who's being paid by very wealthy clients out in the lobby to influence members of the legislature. So I believe all these things are fair to be able to ask, to readjust from one generation to the next. We don't have to lock this in stone. And so I hope that people continue to ask questions and ask, is there a better way?
once again, thank you all for attending, and thank you to all of our panelists.
Thank you. Yeah.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.